Okay, good morning, folks. It's Friday morning, so we're close to the end of Mises U, which makes me very sad. I hope you're, still seething with excitement over everything that you've learned this week, and looking forward to the last couple of days because we still got a lot of great stuff going on, including this morning's talk on government and big business, right? So I've been having some interesting conversations with friends, colleagues on social media about the terminology that we use to describe a market system, right? Is the word capitalism the best term to use to describe a free market economy based on private property and maximum economic liberty and so forth? Or should we use a different term? Is free market economics a term that makes sense and is clear? One of the difficulties with the word capitalism is that it kind of privileges one factor of production, capital, right, over other factors of production, right? You could say, well, a free society could be laborism if people choose not to use, if market participants choose not to accumulate a lot of capital and have large production processes, maybe they prefer smaller ones, right? I mean, as far as an empirical prediction about what the world would look like in the absence of government intervention in markets, would we have large accumulations of capital? Would most production take place in large enterprises such that we would call it capitalism, meaning capital is kind of the dominant controlling factor? Or would we have small scale, cottage production with very little accumulation of capital? Well, I mean, from a praxeological point of view, we can't really say. That's an empirical question. I'd love to just try it and see. But it turns out historically, right, that large enterprises characterized by large accumulations of capital have been historically very important for society, for economic development, economic growth, improvements in the standard of living. So most of us, most students of Austrian economics and people who advocate free and open markets tend to have a fairly sympathetic picture of large enterprise, right, big business. And it rubs us the wrong way. We get very annoyed with sort of the typical portrayal of big business in Hollywood, in popular culture. Look at classic film, It's a Wonderful Life, of course, which is in many ways a great, Christmas story, great Christmas movie. Frank Capra made a lot of really good films in the mid-20th century, but of course, the evil villain in It's a Wonderful Life is Mr. Potter, who is the grubby, money-grubbing, fat cat, capitalist pig. And this whole subplot about central banking, of course, which is interesting too. If you remember the movie Wall Street with Michael Douglas back in the 80s, then they made a sequel to it, which was not very good, with Shia LaBeouf, which means it's not going to be very good, where he says, he has the famous "greed is good" speech, which is actually a pretty good speech. If you watch the "Greed is Good" speech, I actually sort of agree with him. One of the Bond films, or a lot of the Bond films, have, in the early days, they had, Russian terrorists as the villains, and then it became, CEOs were the typical villains. This is nothing new, of course. In the 19th century, the big industrialists like John D. Rockefeller Jr. were routinely, eviscerated in the media. Standard Oil was this horrible, was this horrible serpent with John D. Rockefeller as its head, sucking up and eating all I don't know, small companies and people and all good things, right? So, we typically in popular culture have had, popular culture has a pretty negative view of large enterprise, right? Even just this is a couple of days ago. What's today, the 19th, 20th? So earlier this week, I saw this story about Jeff Bezos, right? So as you may know, President Trump has been complaining. Trump, of course, is on kind of a little bit of, a vendetta against, Twitter and Facebook and Google and CNN and Amazon and any number of other companies. One of his complaints about Amazon is that Amazon has benefited from, the post office, right? The fact that they can send packages cheaply using the taxpayer subsidized delivery system has been a huge boon. Of course, I think Trump views Bezos as a kind of pro-Democrat, left-wing political opponent. And then Bezos kind of said something himself just earlier this week. Well, yeah, we probably wouldn't have gotten so big or been so successful if it hadn't been for the post office. I'm going to talk a little bit later about, in my talk at 1 o'clock today, on technology policy and this controversy over Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which is sometimes interpreted as providing a de facto subsidy, a taxpayer-funded subsidy for the big tech platforms, right? So, we would say people who defend free and open markets and economic liberty and personal liberty would say, well, gosh, if there are companies that have gotten big because of taxpayer subsidy or special government privilege, I talked about this a little bit the other day in the monopoly lecture, then that would be a concern, right? So here's another way to put it. If the question is big business harmful to society, to the economy, and so forth? A lot of the discussion focuses on, well, just how big are these big businesses? Amazon has a very large share of the online retail market in the US. Alibaba has a very large share in China. Of course, Walmart is still much larger than Amazon. Walmart has a very large share of the market for brick and mortar retail and so forth. Google has a big market share in search, et cetera. We would say, look, that's really not the right question. How big is a firm in terms of sales or assets? How profitable is a firm? How many current competitors does a firm have? That's not the right question. You remember from the monopoly lecture that just counting the number of firms in an industry today or computing some kind of concentration index, right, is not a good measure of how competitive a market is. The right question from our point of view, if we want to ask, is big business doing good or doing harm, is how did big business X get to be big? Did it get to be big because it pleased its customers more than its rivals, right? Or did it get to be big because it had some kind of a special privilege, right? So there's two kinds of there's the good big business and the evil big business, right? And sometimes it's not obvious just from inspection which category a particular company belongs in. So to gain some insight into that, let's take a step back and talk more generally about the role of government in business, in commerce, in industry. There's kind of the sort of textbook view that you get. You probably learned this in your classes in high school if you took a civics class or something like that, or if you took mainstream econ courses. You learn that, well, the reason that we have regulation in the economy, business regulation, industry regulation, is to correct for market failure. So-called market failure in quotes, right? In other words, regulation, like everything else that the government does, is to protect the public interest. It's to improve the well-being of the public. Now, that could mean a more sophisticated public interest view would say something like, well, we agree that property rights are important, but property rights have to be provided by the state or defined by the state or assigned and protected by the state. So you need a benevolent government to define and enforce property rights. A lot of problems with that view, as you may know. Property rights emerge endogenously through custom and convention and so forth. When the government tries to create and enforce property rights, it does so in a way that privileges special interests and so forth. And the common economics textbook answer, mainstream textbook answer, is you've got all these kind of market failures, you have externalities and undersupply of so-called public goods, monopoly, and et cetera. And therefore, the reason we have business regulation, and loosely speaking, you could include antitrust and environmental rules and so forth, is to protect the public interest from harm. Because in an unregulated market, the textbooks would say, businesses, especially big ones, can do all kinds of things that harm the public, harm society, and so forth. I mean, the reason I call that the high school civics view is because, like most of what you learn in high school, it's completely naive and foolish, incomplete at best. And I think most economists recognize that that's not the right way to look at business regulation, that in fact, lots of kinds of regulation and many circumstances in which regulation is applied are really protecting private interests, right? The private interest view of business regulation says that really what government is doing, or what government policies are typically doing, is benefiting some interest groups at the expense of others. Right? So even without expressing an opinion on desirability, almost all economists, if you press them, will concede that government regulations typically benefit some groups at the expense of others. And, it's obvious in the case of like a tariff, right? Trump wants high steel tariffs to prevent imports of Chinese steel. With just a little bit of, it doesn't take a very sophisticated analysis to recognize that there are winners and losers, so to speak, right? I mean, that means that steel prices will go up in the U.S., domestic steel producers will increase their market share, will increase their profitability. Domestic consumers are worse off because they'll pay higher prices. Foreign producers will be worse off because it's more, their costs of sending steel to the U.S. have gone up and so forth. I mean, most of us, everybody in this room, and most people who can think through a little very simple analysis can recognize that tariffs aren't just for America, right? I mean, they benefit some, U.S. tariffs benefit some Americans at the expense of some other Americans and foreigners and so forth. Less obvious to most people, but obvious to most of us, easy to see, is that a lot of other kinds of regulation also have this kind of effect. Right, so health and safety rules, environmental rules benefit large firms and typically incumbent firms over smaller firms. Right, think about regulations that say you have to have you can't have stairs going into a building. You've got to have a ramp, for disabled access. You need to have a special bathroom, parking spaces, and so forth. Those are nice things, right? And they provide benefits to people with different kinds of physical disabilities. But if you think about it just in terms of types of businesses, if you're a Walmart store or you're some, some giant office building downtown, you're spending millions of dollars to build this thing. You're a huge store or a branch of a huge chain. It's no problem whatsoever to install that kind of equipment. But if you're a little mom and pop store, the cost of installing a ramp or designating, repainting your parking lot, installing handrails and so forth in the bathroom, those costs can be significant given your small scale of operation and what might be, razor thin profit margins. So large firms, if you look at, lobbying records, large firms typically lobby very strongly for health and safety regulations, higher minimum wages, stricter safety regulations on the job, stricter environmental rules, more strict FDA testing and so forth. And you think, why would firms lobby for regulations that increase their own costs? Well, it's because they think it will increase increase their rivals' costs even more, right? So I'm willing to impose some regulation on myself if I think it's going to impose a higher cost on somebody else than on me, right? On my rival than me. So a lot of these rules typically have the effect of benefiting large firms over small ones. You know, in general, firms that are politically connected, right? Because in many parts of the world, you know, the CEO is the brother of the prime minister, or because the firms have spent more on lobbying, whatever. Politically connected firms can use the regulatory system to their advantage. Excuse me. And there are a lot of theories in political economy, public choice economics, and so forth that try to drill down and identify the specific circumstances under which various types of firms can use the regulatory system to their advantage. We know that in settings where the benefits from some regulation are concentrated among a small group and the costs can be spread out over large numbers of people, then those sort of special interest regulations are more likely to prevail and to persist, right? Because the beneficiaries they can organize themselves politically to lobby and so forth. It's in their interest to do so, whereas those who bear the cost are not really motivated to act. In the United States, we have a very small sugar producing industry. We have beet sugar in the Midwest, but we actually grow some cane sugar in Louisiana and in Florida, and it's horribly unprofitable. Right? In a free market, the U.S. would import pretty much all of its sugar from Brazil, but because we have tariff protection for these Louisiana and Florida sugar makers, right? They can produce sugar cane profitably because of this tariff on imported cane sugar from Brazil. You know, I don't know, there's like 20 families that produce cane sugar in the U.S. So those 20 families spend a lot of time making sure those tariffs stay in place. You and I all pay, you know, a couple pennies more for sweet goods than we otherwise would, but who cares, right? We're not going to take our time to go march on Washington to get the sugar tariff repealed because it's not worth it, right? So if you can spread the pain, nobody's going to oppose you in getting your special favors. The regulatory economist Bruce Yandel famously introduced the concept of bootlegger and Baptist coalitions. Right? So by bootlegger, he means a party that gets some sort of, you know, financial or other benefit from regulation. What he means by a Baptist is like a party which supports a regulation because it's in the public interest, right? So this is the classic example. Think about prohibition in the U.S. in the 1920s, right? Which sorts of groups advocated for prohibition? Well, there were groups, religious groups and feminist groups and others who claimed that alcohol was harmful to society. Alcohol abuse was a big problem. The Women's Christian Temperance Union argued that because, you know, I guess most men, all men, I don't know, men were drunk all the time. They didn't show up for work. They would come home and beat their wives and kids or whatever. And so banning alcohol will improve, you know, the public welfare in various ways. Or, you know, alcohol is sinful, et cetera. But of course, you also have the bootleggers, the mafia, right? Al Capone became the most powerful mafia don, I guess, in the U.S. during that period because of his control over the illegal alcohol bootlegging industry. So bootleggers want alcohol to be illegal because then they can sell their bootleg alcohol at super high prices, right? But if you're a bootlegger, you can't go in front of the public. You know, you didn't have TV back then, but you couldn't go on radio if you're Al Capone and say, hey, Americans, you know, please join me in supporting prohibition because it's making me a blank load of money and it's giving me power and I'm now, you know, killing people and it's awesome, it's great. I mean, he can't do that, right? But Yandel's point was the bootleggers don't have to do that. They can just remain in the shadows and let the so-called Baptist groups, in other words, those who are advocating for the regulation because it benefits the public, let those people do the talking for them. Right, so modern example, you know, I talked about some of these environmental rules. Large companies favor stricter environmental regulation because it increases their profits by imposing differential harm on their smaller rivals. But, you know, CEO of some big company can't go on TV and say, yeah, we need, you know, we all need to lower our carbon footprints, and we need the government to force, green energy and blah, 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 because we are making a lot of money on that. But they don't have to do that because Greenpeace and the Sierra Club and, I don't know, all the major media, and everybody else is out there saying, yes, climate change, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So if you're benefiting from some regulation, it's good for you if you can have a front group who, not necessarily with explicit coordination, but is sort of doing the lobbying for you. That tends to help. So what about kind of social and cultural perspectives on business? Well, what you might call, I don't know if this is exactly the right terminology, I'll call it a sort of mainstream libertarian view, which was most famously expressed in an essay by Ayn Rand in the 1960s called Big Business, America's Persecuted Minority, right? And Ayn Rand's argument was, sort of building on those pictures I was showing you at the beginning of the talk. She was saying big business really is a tremendous force for good in society, right? The Industrial Revolution, capitalism, the Industrial Revolution lifted more people out of poverty than any sort of force in human history, and even just in the last, I don't know, decade or so, several decades, you see these websites like humanprogress.org with these charts. Have you seen those? If you look at one of those charts of, estimated GDP per capita from prehistoric times, it's pretty flat. There's basically no change in GDP per capita. And then you get to start of the 18th century and it goes whoop. Right now we all expect progress. We expect, to live longer. We expect our computers to get faster, our phones to be better, our cars to be better, our healthcare to be better, and so forth. But throughout most of human history, people didn't have any expectation that circumstances would improve because we didn't have capitalism and industry, right? So the Industrial Revolution was a huge boon to mankind. And like I said, just in the last few decades, the number of people lifted out of extreme poverty is greater than it ever has been before, et cetera. So, Ayn Rand's view was capitalism is awesome, or as she titled her book of essays, it's an unknown ideal, right? But yet Hollywood and politicians and the media and so forth are always dumping on capitalism, or neoliberalism as they call it now. You've all seen the pictures of these Antifa types, with their Starbucks and their iPhone 10, organizing the next window smashing or beating up journalists or whatever in protest of capitalism, right? So Tyler Cowen has a book that just came out a few months ago called Big Business, A Love Letter to an American Anti-Hero, which I've read about, but I haven't read yet. And apparently he makes not exactly the same argument as Ayn Rand, but makes what I would call sort of the standard libertarian arguments that, of course, politically connected big businesses, crony capitalists can do harm, but in general, big business does a tremendous amount of good and doesn't get recognized for it, et cetera. I think in the early parts of the libertarian movement, that was kind of the sort of standard view, and that's probably the majority view among libertarians even now. But, there's some kind of alternative views on this too. In the 1960s, there was a group of historians that have been termed the New Left historians, people like William Appleman Williams and James Weinstein and Gabriel Kolko, many of whom were business historians, who argued that, well, in fact, a lot of the sort of 20th century welfare state regulations that were the antitrust rules in the late 19th century and all the progressive era health and safety rules and so forth really were not curbing the excesses of big business as they were advertised, but were really promoted by big business and supported by big business, and the rules were even written by big businesses, right? Probably the most famous, best-known example are these books by Gabriel Kolko, who wrote a famous book on the railroad regulation, and then his, I think I might have the dates of those wrong. I think Triumph of Conservatism was later than 63, 68 maybe. Anyway, his most famous book, The Triumph of Conservatism, is a kind of revisionist history of the progressive era. Because, you guys learned in school that the progressive era was when the people, reacted to the bad things done by big business by imposing regulation and so forth. And Kolko and his colleagues argued that no, all those regulations were designed by big business to protect them from newer, more nimble and more efficient competitors. Okay, this is very similar to the view that Murray Rothbard also took, right? So if you heard Patrick Newman give some talks this week, last year we published a new book of previously unpublished Rothbard chapters as a book called The Progressive Era, where Rothbard argues that the antitrust movement was really a reaction against competition by sort of crony capitalists. The Progressive Era, as already mentioned, was not anti-business, but was really was something engineered by big businesses to protect themselves against rivals. Even world wars, the New Deal, and so forth. All of these sets of policies can be understood, or at least were influenced by large, successful, politically connected businesses using the state to their advantage. So if you haven't read the book, I strongly recommend that you check it out. What exactly is the argument? I mean, what is it that some businesses can get out of their partnership with the government, right? What is it that government can do to help businesses? Or to put the question another way, what is kind of the overall effect of government intervention on business in the typical country? So there are a couple different ways we can think about it. One is to talk about what you might call effects on the objectives of business. There's this cute quote that's attributed to the humorist P.J. O'Rourke. When buying and selling are controlled by legislation, the first things to be bought and sold are legislators. In other words, right, in a world like ours, where we have a government that is involved very extensively in the economy, right? So legislators are controlling buying and selling. How do you make money? Well, you got to get control of those legislators, right? So you've got to spend money on acquiring politicians through lobbying and bribery and all kinds of even darker means, right? Because you need the government on your side in order to make money, right? So, by the way, I want to note this is not necessarily sort of a condemnation of business officials, business executives, managers, and so forth. I mean, if you're the manager of a company, you're the CEO of a big corporation, or even the manager of a mom and pop store, I mean, you have a fiduciary contractual obligation to make money for the owners, right? The CEO is supposed to be doing what's in the best interest of shareholders. So there's kind of an ethical dilemma. If you are a libertarian CEO, should you lobby the state for favors? Ethically, you say, I don't feel comfortable doing that. I don't think I should do that. In terms of positive analysis, you might recognize, well, gosh, if we're all lobbying the state for favors, that means more intervention. That means a less productive and efficient economy. That means we're all worse off somehow. But it's kind of like a prisoner's dilemma, right? If all the other firms are lobbying the state for goodies, you're sort of not doing right by your shareholders if you don't also lobby the state for goodies, even though you feel uncomfortable about it, right? So that's kind of a separate issue of how you should act in this interventionist economy. There's the Walter Block philosophy. Walter Block says anybody in this room, if you can get a government grant, if you can get the government to give you money, you should take it. Because in Walter's view, it's better for those funds to be in the hands of a libertarian than in the hands of some statist, right, who will use it for bad things. Walter says, you're liberating that money. It's like you're stealing it from the bad guys, and now it's in the hands of the good guys, and that's a good thing. But I'm not talking about that point specifically. What I mean is, think about all of the discussion in many countries. The U.S. is the case I know best, of concerns about how much money is spent in elections. Right, some of you are from countries where elections are financed by the public treasury. Right, in the U.S. we don't have that, though we do have some matching funds. So there's all this thing, there's so much money in politics, and since the famous Citizens United decision, what was that, 2010? Now it is legal for corporations to give money directly to political causes and political candidates, and there are all these measures, all these studies trying to show how much is being spent on campaigns and how terrible this is. And there are lots of proposals, campaign finance reform proposals. Either eliminate all private money in politics altogether, make campaigns be state funded, but that doesn't sound like a good idea to me. Place limits on how much corporations and unions and individuals can give, and enforce, more transparency, where any money that you have to give, you have to disclose. So in the US, individuals have to disclose publicly their contributions for candidates. Corporations do, but not all so-called political action committees. Super PACs do not have to disclose their donors, leading to the rise of what some people call dark money, right? So the dark money in politics is big campaign contributions and contributions to various associations that can't be tracked. My reaction to that is, first of all, the empirical evidence suggests that none of those proposals really work. Campaign finance reform doesn't seem to affect how much money people spend or who wins elections. But if you're really concerned that people are spending too much money trying to get their favorite politician elected, then wouldn't it be better if we had a world in which you had no reason to care which politician got elected, because that politician was in no position to impose any costs on you, right? In a free society, who would care? Maybe we got a president or something, some sort of ceremonial figure who attends, signs treaties and, like the British royals or whatever, dresses in fancy clothes and is in a procession every once in a while, but cannot affect my well-being or the profitability of my business. I'm not going to lobby for that person. I'm not going to spend money on that person. It's the fact that it matters so much to a business which party is in control, which legislators in your region are in office, that you want to spend so much money to get the guys you want, guys and gals you want. Okay. There's a number of other effects too. There are, Mises argued in his very clear and I would highly recommend to you his book Bureaucracy. It's a small book where he describes, summarizes his position on socialist calculation, but also talks about how government intervention makes firms different than they otherwise would be. Not necessarily larger, but kind of more bureaucratic, more layers of middle management, less of a connection between what employees do and how much they get paid, because according to Mises, of various kinds of regulation, right? So, taxes and regulations distort profit signals, so it's harder for shareholders and others to know how well managers and employees are performing. I think it was, what was it? I think, was it Jeff Dice talking about, who was talking about, no, I think it was Lou Rockwell last night, that Henry Hazlitt said back in the day it was easy to get a job as a newspaper reporter because it was easy to fire people. They would hire anybody because if they didn't like you, they'd fire you. Right now, it's very hard to fire people, to close shops and so forth, especially in Western Europe. You have a lot of inefficiency in sort of the employment relation. You've got all these people who work for companies whose job is just to make sure the company is meeting all the regulations. In the last decade or so in universities, where I see it the most, but also in large companies, there's this huge emphasis on compulsory diversity training, right? So you have lots of people who are employed by big companies and other organizations whose job is to run sensitivity training seminars that are compulsory for all employees. People whose job is to fill out forms to make sure that all of the different EEOC kinds of requirements are met. Well, Mises would argue those are people who are not producing stuff. Those are people who are not producing goods and services that the company can sell to the market. Those are people whose job is to make sure that the company doesn't get in trouble with the state. That's a drag on productivity. It's increasingly recognized, by the way, that these diversity training programs, not only do they not improve profitability, they don't even improve employees' attitudes towards diversity. So there's several studies suggesting that employees' attitudes towards people who do not look like them in race, gender, or sexual orientation or whatever, people have more negative opinions of colleagues who don't look like them after they've been through mandatory diversity training, which they resent, than before they went through mandatory diversity training. Now there's another whole set of rules in financial markets, in markets for mergers and acquisitions and takeovers and so forth, where the government makes it more difficult for the capital markets, lenders, other firms that might want to engage in a so-called hostile takeover to replace poorly performing managers through buyouts and so forth. So there are a lot of policies of the state that not only make firms focus their attention on influencing the state, but also make firms less efficient and more bloated, more bureaucratic than they otherwise would be, okay? So that's something important to keep in mind when we're looking at big business. But sort of, does this mean, am I saying that the net effect of government intervention is to make firms too large? That's a position taken by some libertarians today. And we see this quite well, right? There are lots of policies that promote firms being large, okay? Already mentioned, these kind of lobbying things and how regulations benefit large firms at the expense of small. But you can think of it this way: if there are fixed costs to lobbying, right? You got to set up an office in Washington, D.C. or Brussels or wherever. You've got to hire a staff of lobbyists. You've got to learn lobbying procedures and so forth. Once you've paid those fixed costs, you can amortize. If you can spread those costs out among a greater volume of activity, you lower your average cost, right? So the point is, it's cheaper for large firms to lobby than for small firms because of this, because of these fixed costs. That suggests that there are economies of scale and maybe economies of scope in lobbying. So we would expect lobbying to happen on a large scale and be done primarily by larger firms. There was this, when Mark Zuckerberg appeared before Congress last year, do you remember that, when he was testifying about the Cambridge Analytica data breach and so forth? There was this great moment where Zuckerberg, I guess he went off script, and he said what Michael Kinsley famously described as a gaffe, or the Michael Kinsley definition of a gaffe is when a politician accidentally says something true. Okay, so Zuckerberg says, at one moment he says, congressmen, congresswomen, and so forth, you realize that the kinds of things you want to do to Facebook and Twitter, et cetera, we can accommodate those at Facebook. This isn't going to be that hard for us to meet whatever privacy rules you want to impose on us. But you got to realize that startups can't do that. Back when we were small, we wouldn't have been able to do that. And you're really going to hurt the vibrancy of the innovation sector by imposing these strong privacy rules. It's going to make it harder for new firms to come into the market. Then a few minutes later, he was back on script. Senator, I want to assure you that we at Facebook look forward to working with you and designing rules that are fair and protect the public, et cetera, et cetera. And there's lots of subsidies, right? Government gives cash handouts, right? I mean, look at Elon Musk, bless his heart, right? He's very entertaining. He's very clever. I heard Peter Thiel once describe Elon Musk, a good friend, as like an Ayn Rand villain, like the villain in an Ayn Rand novel, right? This sort of evil, devious genius. Tesla gets a lot of direct subsidies in setting up its factories and SpaceX and so forth. What about firms like Goldman Sachs? And the other so-called primary dealers. I don't know if this came up in any of your lectures on monetary policy this week, but in the textbooks when it says, well, to increase the money supply or decrease the money supply, the Fed performs open market operations. It buys or sells treasury bonds. If the Fed is going to sell a treasury bond, you and I can't go buy one. Okay, there's a handful of firms, the so-called primary dealers, who are the only ones who get to buy and sell the bonds from the Fed, and then eventually it circles out in these Cantillon effects, right, to the rest of the world. So if you believe in this redistribution through the monetary injections, who gets the new money first benefits at the expense of those who get the new money later. I think Sandra Klein mentioned that in her talk too. Well, it's Goldman Sachs and firms like Goldman Sachs that get the new money first. No, not to mention the fact that almost every Treasury Secretary is a former Goldman Sachs executive, et cetera. Boeing gets huge subsidies. The U.S. Domestic airlines, the big three airlines, get big subsidies. Then they complain about their competitors like Emirates and Etihad getting big subsidies from the Gulf countries. So obviously, those kinds of firms, right, are larger than they would be in the absence of the big interventionist state. We probably wouldn't have financial firms as big as Goldman Sachs. We wouldn't have Lockheed Martin and Boeing and other defense contractors and so forth. A little bit harder to judge is these so-called indirect subsidies, like what I mentioned before with Jeff Bezos. Some people have argued, well, Walmart gets to ship its goods on government-provided roads, so Walmart doesn't bear the full cost of transportation. And of course, the whole Walmart business model is based on aggregation, right? You have these large regional distribution centers, massive distribution centers that are shipping merchandise out to the Walmart stores, right? And in the absence of this kind of hub and spoke distribution model, it would not be possible for Walmart to operate on the scale on which it operates. And so people say, well, if we really had private roads and everybody had to pay the marginal cost of using the roads, then Walmart could never have gotten so big. Amazon would not be so successful if it hadn't been able to free ride on not only the post office, but all the aviation subsidies and air traffic control system provided by the taxpayers and so forth. I mean, that's harder to judge, but you can make an argument that those indirect subsidies certainly are relevant. So does it follow that in the absence of government intervention, we would have mostly, we would have smaller firms on average? Would we not have big business as we know it today in the absence of the state? Well, I think that is not at all obvious. And the reason is, yes, of course, there are a lot of government policies that favor size, but there are also government policies that promote smaller firms. Right, so I mean, antitrust does not go after mom and pops. Antitrust goes over large firms. Antitrust policy or competition policy more generally increases the cost of becoming a big firm, because when you get to a certain size, then the antitrust authorities are going to come after you, or more likely to come after you. There's what the late Fred McChesney, a great economist at Northwestern University, called rent extraction. What he meant by rent extraction was this practice of the state kind of vaguely threatening private companies, well, we might, if these firms don't do, if the tech platforms don't, plug these privacy leaks, we're going to have to regulate hard. Guess what happens in the next election cycle? Those politicians get much more contributions from tech companies. Right? It's kind of like an extortion racket. One of the interesting pieces of evidence for this is if you look at patterns of campaign spending. This is a recent article. A lot of big corporations give equally to both Democratic and Republican parties, associations, candidates, et cetera. Well, why would you give equal money to both sides? Because don't you want to give money to the side that has the policies that you think are better? Well, no, the fact that they give equally to both sides suggests that these donations are what? Protection money, right? You want to make sure that whoever gets elected is your friend, right? So it's not about supporting this policy or that policy. It's buying insurance against the politicians hurting you later. Okay, so little firms don't have to worry about this, but big firms do. There's all the disclosure requirements for publicly traded firms that make it more costly to be a joint stock company, a publicly traded company, as opposed to a small one. There are a lot of subsidies for little firms. There are cash handouts of all kinds for little firms. You could argue that government subsidized energy and telecommunications make it easier to have like a little mom and pop store in your basement because you got electricity from the grid that's subsidized by the state. right? In the absence of the state, maybe it would be more costly to send electricity around the world and to communicate around the world, so people would agglomerate and you'd have bigger concentrations of production. That's certainly possible. And of course, all the other sort of generic kinds of policies that we worry about, barriers to trade and war and state control of education, all these things retard the international division of labor, right, making the economy less efficient than it otherwise would be. And maybe reducing the kinds of economies of scale and economies of scope that support large-scale production. Okay, so it may very well be that in the absence of state intervention, we would see larger firms on average than the ones we have today. Or maybe it would vary widely by sector, by region. We might see a greater diversity of different types of organizational forms. And of course, my view is, let's do it, right? Let's run that experiment and see. I don't have a dog in the fight, a specific defensible prediction about exactly what would happen, but I sure would like to try it. Roderick Long and I had an online debate, I guess it's 10 years ago now, that you can look up on whether the state makes firms more hierarchical than they otherwise would be. Roderick says yes. I say we don't know, but probably no. We also argued a little bit about limited liability. You may have heard people say that limited liability is a special protection for corporations. It turns out it's a lot more complicated than that, because there's different kinds of limited liability, right? There's limited liability for debt, meaning that if you're a limited liability company and you can't pay your debts, your creditors can get the assets of the firm, but they can't come after your personal assets. They can't get your house, your kids' college savings fund or whatever. That, of course, has nothing to do with government intervention. That's just a market arrangement worked out between creditors and borrowers, right? In a free market, if you're a company, you want to raise funds, you want to get a loan, you would negotiate with the bank. Okay, does that loan mean that if you can't pay it back, we can go after your personal assets? If so, we'll probably give you a lower interest rate. If you want to shield your personal assets from liability, you want to have limited liability, okay, you can do that, but we'll probably charge you an interest rate premium. You can choose, you can work it out. The more complicated issue is limited liability for torts. So should corporations be liable if an employee harms somebody? And some libertarians say yes, but state limited liability rules immunize companies from that liability, and that's a special subsidy or protection for big firms. I don't think that's right, because in fact it assumes that in the absence of the state, the sort of common law remedy for harms done by employees would be to sue the employer, but in fact that's not really true. It depends on the contract between the employer and the employee. If the employee causes harm not at the request of the employer, then the employer probably wouldn't be liable anyway under the common law. So my view is that limited liability is not a subsidy for big firms, okay? But there's some libertarians who disagree. Okay, so to summarize, does government help big business? Yes, but it also helps small business. Government policy has lots of different effects on the economy, on firms, on organization. Corporations benefit from the state, but corporations are harmed as well. Limited liability is not an obvious artificial state privilege. So, again, as I said before, what would the firm look like on the purely free market? Well, I don't think we can really say praxeologically ex ante, but let's give it a try, okay? Yeah.
Thank you all for showing up. I know it's late in the week and everybody's getting maybe a little bit of fatigue, but glad to have you here this morning for a talk that I hope will be of interest to many of you, since many of you are in higher education, for better or worse, as we'll see. So maybe I can help you see what is going on in higher education, a bigger picture. Some of you see maybe what's going on at your college or university, and some of you see what's going on with a few of your friends. I would say that, true to the title of the talk, that higher education really is in a crisis today. There are three crises that I'd like to focus on. Really, the first two are the ones that I'd like to spend the most time on. If we have time, I'd like to go through the third. But they are, first, that college doesn't do what it advertises. Some of you may have figured this out already. And for that matter, that's why some of you are here. It's because you are not getting the kind of thing that the Mises Institute is providing through its Mises University program, and you are buying books and reading materials online and listening to podcasts that is educating yourself beyond what a college or university is doing with you. In fact, you may find yourself countering some of what can only be described as propaganda coming out of colleges and universities. And the second crisis I'd like to spend some time on here is the cost of college. We've seen a rise, at least in the United States, and I think in other developed countries as well, in the amount of government funding, or that is taxpayer funding, that's going to higher education. I gave a talk yesterday on medical care economics and the finance of medical care, and we see a very similar thing going on there, that the government has funneled more and more money into medical care, and this has happened over some decades, and yet we see medical prices rising, and it doesn't seem that medical care is more affordable than it once was. I would say that higher education also is suffering an affordability crisis as well. People are finding themselves in massive amounts of student loan debt. I've got a slide to give you the exact number, but I think it's about $1.6 trillion right now just in the United States in student loan debt. Defaults on student loans are a real problem, and so I think that's an important thing to discuss. And then finally, if we have time, I'd like to go through just briefly some of the problems with academic discourse today. Some of you have seen some of the stories, the politicized classrooms where and professors are sometimes running scared because they are worried about something that they might say in the classroom being misconstrued, or this idea of academic freedom, of being able to say what you believe is correct in the classroom. If that's not politically correct, then you may find yourself out of a job, or at least persecuted substantially because of what you have said in the classroom. This has afflicted both left and right. The professors who may have thought themselves safe from criticism from the left may find that they're just not left enough, and they have criticism from all sides. So I think that's a problem as well. If you look to a university as a place to freely discuss ideas, then what's happening when we find that certain ideas will be shut down, certain speakers will be deplatformed simply for voicing something that is different from what others believe should be permissible speech. So we'll talk about that if we have some time. So the first crisis I'd like to mention here is that college does not do what it advertises. It's not providing what people expected college to provide. So let's think a little bit about what college does do. Does it transfer skills? I think that's the typical perception that college is there to teach you something, that you're supposed to walk out with your degree at the end of the 4 years or however long the program is, and you're supposed to have some more knowledge in your head than you had when you started, and therefore be a better rounded person, or a person who has more skills that are applicable in the workforce, or whatever it is that you were seeking when you went in the door, you came out with more knowledge and you came out with a better understanding of the society around you than you had when you went in? Or is it possible that college is simply a signal apparatus, that it's a way of communicating to a potential future employer that you are a person who works hard, you're a person who has the ability to think at a different level, you're a person who can engage in a 4-year-long project and complete that project? Is that what you're communicating when you get a degree? And there's been some recent work, and most notably, I think, by Brian Kaplan on that idea. And then third, perhaps it's just a consumption good. I mean, we've all heard of party schools, but perhaps colleges and universities in general are turning into a kind of a party environment for young people to sort of stretch out their dependency on their parents a little longer, maybe get some government subsidized fun out of the experience. So that's certainly a possibility as well, that maybe if you've got enough money to go to college, then you enjoy that 4 years to sort of socialize, and you can maybe take some classes that seem like they might be somewhat interesting to you, but not necessarily classes that would generate a wider range of opportunities once you graduate. Now, we have seen that there is a connection between the amount of education a person receives and the income that that person will have later in life. And maybe that's immediate, and maybe that takes some time to sort of manifest in a person's income or their job prospects. But what we see is that for the highest brackets of income here, $100,000 and up, it is much more likely that people in that income range will have a college degree than that you would be in that income range and not have a college degree. There are very, very few people, as you can see here, who are making this kind of income who have only a high school diploma. And so this is sort of the Exhibit A for saying this is why you need to go to college. If you want to have a high income after you, by the time you're in your 30s or 40s, then you need to go to college in order to get that higher income. And so people with lower incomes on the left-hand end of the diagram here, interestingly, we see some people that have college degrees that are in that low income category, and yet people who stop after high school and don't get any college education at all are much more likely to be in that income category. So also you can see this is a chart from Richard Vedder's book, which I'll be referring to at several points today. A brand new book called Restoring the Promise, which I recommend. It's Richard Vedder's been working in this area for a long time and has some interesting things to say about the problems with higher education. So this is a chart from his book, and you can see here that, and this is divided by male, female, and then median and mean. So let's just look at mean workers over 25, male, and you can see high school diploma, about $47,000. And then if you go to professional degree, that'd be like a law degree or something, that would be about $161,000. People with a bachelor's degree, about $85,000. So it does look fairly clear from this that if you're over 25, you can expect, male or female, you can expect to see a pretty big income jump because of a 4-year degree. So this is what you would see from perhaps a high school guidance counselor or somebody who says, well, you need to go to college because, see, you can earn more money. Well, there's some problems with this. Vedder points out, for instance, that one of the problems here is that this is aggregating the entire U.S. population. Over 25 includes people who are quite a bit older than 25 and who went through the higher education process back in the 50s or 60s. And these are individuals who may have gone through their 4-year program, back before the sort of higher education bubble that we may be in the middle of today. They may have gone to college back when having a college degree really did set you apart from the general population in a significant way. But what about people who are just out of college? Is it possible that this group also would see this kind of major income disparity, that they would see a big jump in their income potential after completing 4 years of college? One more slide, sort of the guidance counselor type of slide here, and that's this one. You can see this is college compared to alternative investments, again, looking at kind of an aggregate of all of the college graduates and what kind of rate of return did they get on their college investment. And so having an associate's or bachelor's degree has a pretty high rate of return compared to, say, the stock market or high-quality corporate bonds or gold or long-term T-bills or housing. So again, it looks like this is just a no-brainer. Of course, you should go to college. But again, it's not quite that simple. Here's another chart from Vedder's book, and Vedder is pointing out here that college education is actually not providing what we think it is for younger people particularly. This is the education requirement of occupations held by college graduates. Now, what we do see here is about half of college graduates are in a position that requires a college degree. Okay? But then we see that over a third of college graduates are in a position that requires a high school diploma or less. A high school dropout could get that job, and yet we've got someone with a 4-year degree in the job. Why is this? And then we've got people who, about 11% here, who have more than a high school diploma but have less than a bachelor's degree, and yet they've got the full-blown 4-year degree. So what's happening here? And part of this is that you've got, let's say you've got a coffee shop, and you own a coffee shop and you're trying to hire workers, and you have a position for a barista in your coffee shop, and you have 30 applications for your barista position. And you think, well, how am I going to sort out the 30 applications here? I got to have some way to round file some of these and sort of cut out the chaff before I get to a top 5 or so. So what will I do? Well, an easy way to handle this is to just find whoever's got less education and formal education and drop them from the applicant pool. So you say, well, okay, I've got 12 applicants here for this position who have college degrees. That usually indicates that they're pretty well-motivated people. They'll be my first pick, and I'll just narrow the pool to those 12. There's nothing about being a coffee mixer, barista, whatever, that requires a 4-year college degree in sociology or something. So nevertheless, that might end up being one of the margins on which the employer decides to sort their applicants. So we end up with people who have 4-year degrees that are working in jobs that very clearly don't need those degrees. And in fact, people may figure out that even if they want nothing more than a coffee barista level kind of job, their opportunities for getting such jobs are better if they have a college degree. And if government or other parties are subsidizing the attainment of that 4-year degree, and if the 4 years that they spend in college is a fun time anyway, then why not spend a little extra time in college? Other people may be paying the bill. The experience is entertaining to some degree, so just enjoy your time and then go out and get a job that, yeah, maybe you didn't really need the knowledge you might have gained in college anyway before you got that job. So here's another chart from Vedder. This is jobs requiring a college degree versus the number of college graduates. Note the significant disparity between the two categories here. We've got jobs requiring a college degree, about 29 million of these jobs, and then we've got about 42 million employed college graduates. So again, we've got people filling jobs that don't require that level of education. this I thought was one of the more interesting charts in his book, and then we'll move on to some things from Brian Kaplan and others. But this is from 1970 to 2010. Taxi drivers, shipping and receiving clerks, salesmen and sales clerks, firefighters, carpenters, and bank tellers, people that require, in order to do their job and do it very, very well, they may need only a high school diploma, or maybe less. And yet, in the period of time, 4 decades, from 1970 to 2010, we've seen the percentage of taxi drivers and chauffeurs who have a bachelor's degree or more, not a 2-year degree, but a 4-year degree, has soared from around 1 or 2% in 1970 to over 15% in 2010. Salesmen and sales clerks from about 4 or 5% in 1970 to nearly a fourth of these individuals who have bachelor's degrees today. Has the job changed in that amount of time that you really need to have that kind of education in order to do those jobs well? I'd suggest not. Carpenters, firefighters, bank tellers, similar kinds of stories to tell there. So we seem to be over-educating for the kinds of jobs that people are getting when they graduate. Now, I mentioned the signaling hypothesis here. This predates Brian Kaplan's work, but he's got a recent book out on this in which he sort of elaborates on this idea that higher education is not so much the conveyance of knowledge as it is a sorting process, a filtering process. So let's say you've got a population here and you've got 2 kinds of people. You've got highly motivated, intelligent, hardworking kinds of people, and you've got people who are not so highly motivated, intelligent, or hardworking. And the blues here are the highly motivated, hardworking, intelligent, and the reds are the others. So if that's the general population, then maybe you have some of that population that ends up going to this filter we call college. And if the filter is doing what we expect the filter to do in a signaling, under the signaling hypothesis, then those who are not so highly motivated or intelligent or hardworking end up failing or dropping out, and they end up in this box here with people who are unmotivated, undisciplined, and unintelligent. And you've got others who simply say, well, I'm not going to go to college at all. Maybe I'm hardworking, but I'm just going to go apply my hard work to some business that does not expect me to have a degree, and that puts them also in this box. They're uncertified, motivated, persevering, and intelligent people, okay? And then the filter passes some people through, and these are certified, motivated, hardworking, intelligent people. All right, so that means that if you've got a 4-year degree, you have certified yourself and you've communicated something, signaled something to a potential employer that says, hey, I'm hardworking. How do you know I'm hardworking? Well, I did this 4-year project here. And it may not matter whether I did this in electrical engineering or civil engineering or mathematics or physics, but any of those programs require someone to be persevering and hardworking. So there you have it. My GPA is 3.6 or something, and so therefore I have evidence that I'm that sort of person. Talk is cheap, but this 4-year project sorts out those who are just saying that they're hardworking and those that are genuinely of that nature. Well, what does government subsidization do to this kind of process? So when the government, especially after World War II, or I guess it was actually technically in 1944, right before the end of World War II when the GI Bill was passed, we had government subsidization entering higher education in a big way, and that's continued. So now we have taxes being extracted from the population and used to subsidize those within the population who would like to go through this filtering process. The filters don't remain unchanged. If you're a college or university and you've got all this, people suddenly coming to you with piles of money because they've been made eligible for some kind of government subsidy or a Pell Grant or whatever, then if you're a college or university, you're inclined to open your doors a little wider to make it more possible for these people who are offering wads of money to you to go through your filter process. And the incentives are there for you to accept more students. Then the filter may end up still failing some students who end up in this box as before, but it probably passes more as well. It passes students who otherwise may not have made it through the process. And Vedder also goes through some of this in some detail, that colleges have seen a change in their threshold for passing students, that they're willing to pass students through that previously would not have made it, wouldn't even made it to college in the first place, wouldn't have been accepted, and now they're not only accepted but make it through, and perhaps make it through with what looks like a very good GPA. So we end up with people who are being certified as motivated, persevering, and intelligent who are in fact not. You see a couple of the red dots made it through the filter now because the college has effectively lowered its standards in order to collect more of this largesse from the taxpayer that's funneled through these various kinds of government programs. Brian Kaplan says, once workers have been ranked, giving everyone extra years of education is socially wasteful. Furthermore, since the status quo is supported by hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidies, we're probably underusing alternative certification methods like apprenticeships, testing, boot camps, and so on. I would love to know, I don't actually have data on this, how many of the graduates of Mises University put this on their resume and get a boost in their job opportunities because they've been certified as having gone through this kind of process, or what happens if you take the Mundlik, I need my water, Mundlik, somebody say that. Thank you, yes. Thank you. Apparently this is easier for Lithuanian tongues, right? So good. The test, yes. So, so I'd be interested to know if that produces a measurable boost to your opportunities after you take the test, and if that is something that may grow in importance, people seeking out some alternative to higher education. I still can't say it. Mündliche Prüfung. Yes. There we go. Yes. I'd said it before. I knew I could say it again. All right. Signaling explains, Kaplan says, why students are far more concerned about grades than actual learning. They want easy A's, not professors who teach a lot of job skills. Signaling explains also why cheating pays. A successful cheater profits by impersonating a good student. And signaling explains why students readily forget course material on the day after the final exam. I know that never happens to any of you, right? Once you've got the good signal on your transcript, you can usually safely forget whatever you've learned. So Kaplan's arguing that higher education has become kind of an arms race, that the thing is not so much how much knowledge you've collected, but whether you've collected more than the other guy, or at least have a signal that looks like you've collected more knowledge than the other guy. So if you've got more education, more formal years of schooling with a GPA that looks pretty good, if you've got that and the other person who's applying for the barista job does not, then that gives you a leg up in the job market. So we get credential deflation if we were to switch to a system that didn't have this level of government intervention. Right now we've got credential inflation. So what a bachelor's degree might once have gotten you in the job market, it now takes a master's degree to attain. My grandfather on one side had an 8th grade education. did quite well, lived a middle class, comfortable middle class existence, raised a family, and so forth in the mid 20th century with an 8th grade education. Today, that would be very, very difficult to do with an 8th grade education. The credential inflation is working against that possibility. And perhaps you heard Lou Rockwell last night mentioning Henry Hazlitt, who had, I think he said, a 6th grade education, and yet did very well and was able to educate himself in a way that put him on a level with those who had 4-year college degrees and even doctoral degrees at the time. Kaplan says there's little sign that education causes much enlightenment or civic understanding. Even at top schools, most students are intellectually and culturally apathetic, and most professors are uninspiring. And don't hear me as saying that this is all the fault of students not being smart enough or motivated enough, because it's also professors who have gotten sucked into this same kind of system and are apathetic. I mean, there are all kinds of colleges and universities where the professors don't read the papers that students write, if the students are still writing papers at all. They're not reading the papers. Well, it's easier for me to just give an A. Student's not going to complain. I save myself 30 minutes. I'll just assign it an A, the paper an A. Now, this is fraud. If we're to be honest about it, it's fraud. And the students are going along with it, the administration is going along with it, the faculty are going along with it. It's fraud. And yet this has become widespread. Jonathan Newman wrote an article for Mises Wire, I think this is from a year or two ago, on why college degrees are becoming useless. And he points out something that Vedder has also pointed out more recently, that graduates have little to no improvement in critical thinking skills. He says that some of the most prestigious flagship universities' test results indicate the average graduate shows little or no improvement in critical thinking over 4 years. Employers are beginning to discount the degree signal as well. Google, for example, doesn't care if potential hires have a college degree. They look past academic credentials for other characteristics that predict job performance. At Yale College, where 62% of grades are in the A range, proposals to curb grade inflation are in doubt following student protests and faculty concern. Arthur Levine found in a national survey that 41% of students had grade point averages of A- or higher in 2009, compared to just 7% in 1969. This is from gradeinflation.com. It's the change in 4-year college grade distributions nationwide from 1940 to 2012. The red line there that you see that's gone up so much, that's A's. A's. Now about 40, well, now that's 2012. If the trend has continued, then it's probably close to half of the grades being assigned are A's. It's like, I don't know if you remember the Garrison Keillor's radio show, and you probably don't, you're too young, but he had a radio show about this fictional town called Lake Wobegon, where all the children are above average. And B's have dropped somewhat, but only because A's are rising faster. And again, this is part of that fraud. I mean, I think professors are saying, well, I know the students aren't going to show up in my office and just complain, and they're not going to object if I give them an A. If I give them a B, then I've ruined their 4.0. You know, they've been in school for 3 years. They've collected all of these easy A's, and now I'm going to be the target of their wrath. And professors just don't want to deal with that. And so they end up perpetuating this kind of problem. F's, by the way, that's the purple. F's have dropped to less than 5% of all grades assigned. This is again from Vedder's book. So maybe people are getting more A's because they're working harder, right? They're learning more, spending more time studying. We have more intelligent students in the classroom in the first place, so they're just working hard and they earned those A's, right? No. 1961, 40 hours a week spent on academic work in colleges per student on average. By 2003, that had dropped to, what's that, about 27, 28 hours a week on academic work. So, and I've seen this, and it's not just at my college, it's, I think it's at many colleges where students are expecting to not have to work as hard to get an A. All right. Let's look at the next crisis. Government subsidies are backfiring. Now, I mentioned student loans, student debt. So, that's the debt clock as of yesterday. This is at finaid.org. You can find the debt clock, but I'd kind of be curious as to how much it's changed in 24 hours. But anyway, $1.6 trillion and climbing. I gave this talk, or a similar talk last year. I think it was under 1.5. And it was just, it seems like only about 3 or 4 years ago that it crossed $1 trillion, so it's rising. So, according to Bloomberg, college tuition and fees have increased 1,120% since records began in 1978. The rate of increase in college costs has been 4 times faster than the increase in the Consumer Price Index. Again, similar to medical care, we've seen rapid increases in the cost of medical care in the United States. And it's one of the more subsidized, regulated industries in this country. So the CPI here, the Consumer Price Index, and can I say Consumer Price Index without being there? Okay, all right. All right. We understand, disclaimer here, we understand there are massive problems with trying to aggregate prices like this. And nevertheless, these are the statistics that I was able to locate. The statisticians are not Austrian economists, so we make do with what's available. In any case, so here's the CPI, rising price levels, and a rising cost of tuition. Now, some of this is misleading because colleges are engaging in more price discrimination than they once did. Now, price discrimination means you're charging students different prices for the same product. So some students are on a full scholarship, their price is $0. Some students are paying the full sticker price, and many students are paying something in between. So colleges have figured out that they can have a very high sticker price and then study a student's financial information, their household income and so forth, and then match the price to their ability to pay. Now, where you ask, do they get all of this private financial information? The free application for federal student aid, FAFSA, where the income tax information, from a household's tax forms is cross-loaded onto this FAFSA form, and all of this information is then made available to the universities so that they can then tailor the price according to your ability to pay. Now, this is not all bad. It sounds terrible, especially because we've got a negative connotation with the word discrimination, which I would argue this is very different from the use of the word that we normally would see, the context we normally see that word used in. So price discrimination does have at least one salutary effect, which is that students who are low income may have access to college that would not otherwise have had access to college. If everybody had to pay the sticker price, even if the sticker price is lower, you're going to exclude students from college that may otherwise have been able to attend. So this is the percentage of median household income required to go to college. And we can see here that college is requiring a larger and larger fraction of median household income. That is, college affordability is declining in the United States, even though government aid has increased. How can this be? Could it be because when the government subsidizes college education, the colleges and universities say, well, they've got access to this much more money, we'll just raise our prices. And so colleges and universities have seen increases in, or have instituted increases in their tuition on a par with the access to federal and state dollars that students have. So this is not really improving affordability of college education when they can simply rake off that taxpayer money into the coffers of the college or university. And there are all kinds of battles being fought within the administration. Who's going to get all of this extra money? Student services, student medical clinics, and entertainment facilities and athletic facilities for students have all exploded in size over several decades. Spending a lot of this money that's been taken in is not exactly going to student education primarily, but to these other things that make college education more of a consumer good. So students end up, in many cases, borrowing money to fund their education, and they find themselves burdened with debt. This is a chart showing all kinds of debt and the delinquency rates on that debt. The student loan line is the red here, which you can see. Big increase in delinquencies in about 2011, 2012, just a couple of years after the official end of the last recession in the United States, probably related to that. If you look at other kinds of debt, here's credit card debt, big spike about the time of the last recession, and then a decline. But the highest delinquency rate now among all of these different kinds of debt is student loan debt. And the consequences of this for individuals is very serious, are very serious. So William Bennett, writing many years ago, said that increases in financial aid in recent years have enabled colleges and universities blithely to raise their tuitions. And so they have. And there are a number of studies that indicate that this is exactly what colleges and universities have been doing. They say, oh, well, you've got more money, we're going to charge you more. And of course, the student doesn't really have more money. They're simply qualifying for these federal and state aid programs. Larry Singal and Joe Stone in 2007 write that the Bennett hypothesis was not supported for in-state tuition for public universities, but for private universities, increases in Pell Grants appear to be matched nearly 1-for-1 by increases in list and net tuition. Out-of-state tuition for public universities behaves very much like private universities. That is, 1-for-1, approximately 1-for-1 increase, dollar for dollar. You increase your student aid by $1, the tuition goes up by $1. Nicholas Turner in 2012 said intended cost reductions of tax-based federal student aid are substantially offset by institutional price increases for a sample of four-year colleges and universities. Tax-based aid crowds out institutional aid roughly dollar for dollar. Cellini and Golden in 2013, Title IV institutions charge tuition that is about 78% higher than that charged by comparable institutions whose students cannot apply for federal financial aid. Luca, Nadald, and Shin in 2017, there's a pass-through effect on tuition of changes in subsidized loan maximums of about 60 cents on the dollar, smaller but positive effects for unsubsidized federal loans. Most pronounced for more expensive degrees, those from private institutions, and for two-year or vocational programs. I mean, the evidence for this is really stacking up. I won't go through this one here, but again, If it's not dollar for dollar, it's pretty close that we're seeing this increased student aid offset so that the student is perhaps burdening himself or herself with added debt, but not seeing as much of a benefit in the college degree itself. So where does the money go? As I said, there's a lot of infighting within administrations and other interest groups within colleges and universities as to who's going to get this largesse from the taxpayer. Dorms. Well, one egregious example here is Princeton University. Do we have anybody from Princeton here? No? Okay. Spent $136 million on a student dorm with leaded glass windows and a cavernous oak dining hall. The dorm's cost approached $300,000 per bed. NYU has provided $90 million in loans, many of them zero interest and forgivable, which is sort of like a giveaway, to administrators and faculty to buy houses and summer homes on Fire Island and the Hamptons. Former Ohio State President Gordon Gee earned nearly $2 million in compensation last year while living, would have been 2012, while living in a 9,600 square foot Tudor mansion. The Columbus Camelot includes $673,000 in art decor and a $532 shower curtain in a guest bathroom. Ohio State also paid roughly $23,000 per month for Mr. Gee's soirees and $500,000 for him to travel the country on a private jet. University of California, about 2,400 administrative staff just in the president's office of the University of California. Richard Vedder says 30% of the adult population has college degrees, but as we've seen, this doesn't mean that this is where this is improving the outcomes for these students upon graduation. So the money is being soaked up by these administrative salaries and by these dorms and the other lavish facilities for students, improving perhaps the consumption value of a college degree, but not notably improving the outcomes for students upon graduation. So Vedder argues that in housing, we had all these low interest rates created by the Federal Reserve. The government encouraged people to buy a house even if their credit wasn't so good. We're doing the same kind of thing with student loans. We're encouraging people to go to school who don't really have good qualifications, who might be better off in some occupation that doesn't require a college degree. And so Vedder suggests the best thing for us to do is to disinvest or get government out of a college education, stop this kind of arms race in degrees. Just a couple of minutes that I have left, I wanted to mention for-profit education. This was hammered by the the Obama administration recently with arguments that for-profit institutions are taking advantage of students by encouraging them to get student loans and then giving them degrees that are of dubious value. But I think the problem is much larger than for-profit education. And in fact, this is nothing new. We've seen for-profit institutions lately, but they've been around before. In fact, in 1897, more than 92% of college students were enrolled at for-profit institutions. The default rates for those at for-profit institutions or after graduating from for-profit institutions seem to be higher. But the kinds of students that are going to these institutions are probably different than those who are going to the traditional not-for-profit institution. That is, they may be more likely to have credit problems to begin with than students who go to not-for-profit institutions. So it's not at all clear that it's the fault of the institution itself. There have been a couple of cases, maybe more than a couple, of cases where the for-profit institution is engaged in a kind of fraud, but as I've indicated, I don't think that that's unique to for-profit institutions. And the target for these for-profit institutions is students who might otherwise not go to college at all. So as A.G. Smith pointed out in his article, The Bubble in For-Profit Schooling, which is available on Mises.org, he says, as expected, many have ignorantly aimed their weaponry at the profit motive instead of unleashing their fury on the root cause, government interference in the market. Let's see, I'm going to have to skip one or two things here. This is kind of entertaining, I think. So, anyway, I have been teaching in higher education for 22 years. My first classes that I taught were here when I was a graduate student teaching assistant at Auburn. And I've taught mostly at private institutions. I'm now at a small private college in South Carolina. And I've seen the development. I haven't done a lot of research myself on higher education, but I've been in the classroom for a long time. And I've seen the changes in higher education. It's not encouraging. I hope you won't hear what I'm saying here as a discouragement to not go to college, although that may be the best route for some individuals. I'm not suggesting that it's a bad idea to go to college. Many of you are in programs, and I think that's probably a good move for many of you. I hope that you will get your formal education, and you will begin to make contributions to the kind of scholarship that the Mises Institute is trying to encourage and sponsor. The programs like this will be an important part of your education, even though your college or university may not recognize it or encourage it. I think this kind of thing is really vital to giving people the education they need. It's outside of the mainstream. It encourages a breadth of thought that you may not get in the classroom in a typical college or university. So I'll just close by saying I'm really happy that you're here. I think you're doing the right thing. If you're interested in talking to me later on about your higher education prospects or a decision you're trying to make, I can't promise that I've got the answer for you, but I'll try to help you make a more informed decision. So thank you very much.
Yeah, everything's okay. Yeah. Hey. Okay, please take your seats. I'm about to begin. Okay, let's start. This lecture is on deflation, myth, and reality. And I guess to start with, I want to ask, how many people like falling prices? How many people like low prices for consumers' goods? Yes. Okay. You're crazy if you don't raise your hand. Okay. How many people think it's good for the economy that if prices fall? Yeah, okay, good. Okay, I don't think I have to talk. I mean, but I'll just give you some arguments for the position you've already established. So first of all, let me just start with defining deflation. Deflation used to mean, in the 19th century, a literal reduction in the money supply. Okay? Deflation refers to the reduction of a volume. And so that was the initial definition. Then in the early 20th century, there was a bit of a change. People began to call deflation a situation anytime there is an insufficient money supply to serve the expanding needs of trade. That is, as the economy grew, money had to grow sufficiently so that prices didn't fall. So in that case, the focus began to come in the second definition on a fall in prices. Okay, they still had the money supply in the definition. Okay, and today, unfortunately, the modern definition just talks about a fall in the price level as being deflation. Okay, the problem with that is that falling prices are just one of a number of important effects of a reduction in the money supply or an increase in the money supply. Okay? The same is true with the definition of inflation. Today, all it means is a rise in some price index. Okay? It doesn't say anything about the fact that when you increase the money supply, you have a fall in interest rates, you have a redistribution of wealth from one group to another group. So the same thing is true with deflation. I will use this definition as we go on. That is a fall in general prices. Another term I want to introduce is the deflation phobia. Okay, and I think I was one of the first economists to use this term because I wrote an article in the early 2000s criticizing Alan Greenspan. But I would define it as a morbid and irrational fear of falling prices. There's nothing to be afraid of when prices go down. You should be happy, you should be joyous, jumping with glee. Now, however, the central bank wants to promote deflation phobia. It wants the population to be afraid of falling prices because this allows them then to say, we have the cure. The cure is simply increasing the money supply. So Federal Reserve officials really promoted this whole idea of being afraid of deflation. We hadn't had deflation since the early 1930s. And suddenly, in the early 2000s, mysteriously, or not so mysteriously, we had central bankers suddenly trying to scare people about the prospect, not the actual existence, but the prospect of falling prices. Why would they do that? Well, the economy had been in a recession, and the economy was recovering slowly, and they wanted to pump money into the economy. So they wanted an excuse for this. So now they use Fed speak. Fed speak is a form of speech in which you make very equivocal, obscure, and ominous statements without really saying much. So for example, in a speech that was at the time no one took note of before a business group, this was in November 2002, Greenspan, who then was only on the board of, he was on the board of governors of the Fed. He wasn't the chair. He said, notice how this flows. The chance of a significant deflation in the United States in the foreseeable future is extremely small. Okay, Ben, move on. Okay, it's extremely small, we don't have to worry about it. But then he comes back to it and he says, the Fed would take whatever means necessary to prevent, now he's using the word significant deflation in the United States. Who said anything about that? And has sufficient policy instruments to ensure that any deflation that might occur would be both mild and brief. Okay? So now he's saying, well, in case it's not very small, we have tools, we'll protect you. And then he ends, so having said that deflation in the United States is highly unlikely, I would be imprudent to rule out the possibility altogether. Not, as I said, not many people took note of this speech. But 2002, when 2002 ended, it was one of the lowest inflation rates that we had had in the past 20 years. It was 1.6%. Prices had risen. It was still inflation. Prices had risen. That means that prices would have doubled in 45 years. So there's still inflation there, okay? So this almost seemed like a trial balloon, okay? Now you have Greenspan, who is as confused as he looks, okay? So in this caricature here. So he picked this thread up a few months later in testimony before Congress at 2 different times. He says a further drop in inflation would be an unwelcome development. So he was the best at Fed speak. What does that mean, an unwelcome development? And then a little bit later, a few days later, he said, after, by the way, the inflation rate had come out for that for the month before, and there had been a slight decline in prices, okay, just for that 1 month. And so he says, we see no credible possibility that we will at any point run out of monetary ammunition to address problems of deflation, okay? So he's mixing his metaphors, monetary ammunition to address something. I mean, you don't address somebody by shooting him or her, okay? What can he possibly mean here, okay? The meaning is intentionally not clear. It's intentionally nonsensical, but the key is he's trying to scare people, right? I mean, he's talking about monetary ammunition. He's talking about problems of inflation. When you talk about ammunition, it means that, well, you have a serious problem if you have to use ammunition to fight it, okay? So the media, of course, immediately jumps on the bandwagon, okay? Financial writers, media commentators, celebrity economists, and so on, they began to write articles and blog posts. Now, I went through some of these, and these are the actual titles. The deflation monster still lives. The specter ghost of deflation. Why we should fear deflation. The deflation boogeyman haunts the Fed. These are actual titles of articles. The greatest threat facing the U.S. economy, deflation, and defeating deflation, okay? It's a threat, it's right there. They're saying that it's at hand. You say, we're defeating deflation. The deflation dilemma, to be concerned or not to be concerned, and so on and so forth. So, of course, the media's jumped on this. So now everyone's afraid of deflation, okay? Or everyone had begun to become fearful of deflation, and so the Fed then reinforced it all by picking the terminology up and using deflation in its pronouncements. We're getting close to deflation. So the whole thing was they began to focus on inflation not being too low. Now that we have people afraid of deflation, we don't want inflation being too low because it might turn into deflation. So now you had to be afraid of low inflation. And I think the head of the European Union coined the term lowflation, okay, which is inflation, okay. Okay. All right, so what causes deflation? Well, money is a good like any other good, whether it's fiat currency or gold. Its value, and its value in terms of what it can purchase of all the other goods and services in the economy. Its value is determined by supply and demand. So there's 2 ways that you could have deflation from 2 sides. You could have it on the demand side. That could cause falling prices. If people produce more goods and they all try to sell more goods and nothing else changes, there's the same amount of money in the economy, well then the exchange demand for money has gone up. People demand more money. And so prices, the value of money will go up, which means prices will fall, okay? Or if people want to hold more money in relation to their incomes, in relation to prices, okay, rather than invest and spend it, okay, that's also an increase in the demand for money. It's an increase in the demand to hold money, okay? So we demand money in two different ways: by selling things that we have for money and getting money into our possession, or by holding on to the money and spending less of it than we had previously. The other way that prices can fall, that we can have deflation in the modern sense of the word, is if the Fed reduces the amount of reserves in the economy, okay? And that'll be a cold day in hell before that happens. It hasn't happened since the 1930s. Or in some cases, the central bank could also demonetize certain bills, like the Indian government did that a couple of years ago, okay? But deflation from the supply side rarely occurs, from the supply of money side, rarely occurs. Rarely do central banks reduce absolutely the supply of money in the economy. Okay, so what are the kinds of deflation? I wrote an article on this back in the early 2000s, talking about the different kinds of deflation. One kind of deflation which we'll talk about is growth deflation. Another, which I'll get to, is called cash building or speculative deflation. Okay, and I'll get to that. And the third kind is the kind that the government imposes on its people to reverse effects of past inflation. But I won't get to that today. But the first two kinds are benign. Okay, they're good for the economy. They're a natural outcome of a progressive capitalist economy. Okay. The third, since it's undertaken by government, is really an infringement on property rights that distorts the economy. Okay. So I'm going to address three myths that have to do with the first two kinds of deflation. So the first is, if the money supply does not grow fast enough, prices will fall and stifle economic growth. Okay, so let me give you the reality. Falling prices are the natural outcome of growth. Okay. They don't stop growth. In fact, they're one of the benefits of economic growth, okay? In a dynamic capitalist economy where there is increasing capital investment, improvements in technology, intensification of the division of labor, where we divide up labor even more finely, okay? As long as you have those things happening and the money supply is restrained by some market money, like a commodity like gold or silver that has a supply and demand based in the market, okay, then you'll get naturally falling prices. So this is just repeating what I've said. So growth deflation is caused by an increase in the production and supply of goods, okay? As more goods and services come onto the economy, okay, the supplies of these goods and services individually increase and their prices begin to fall, okay? We call that economic growth. And that's caused by technological progress, more investment in capital goods, which makes labor more productive. Okay, if you have more robots aiding in assembling cars, each worker is able to produce more cars per unit of time. And the increase in the amount of goods in the economy causes an increase in the competition among different sellers of different goods for dollars, okay? If you have the same amount of dollars in the economy and people all trying to sell more goods, well, that's great. Then prices will fall, okay? And if, as has happened in the 19th century under the gold standard, if the money supply increases very slowly because of the high cost of mining gold, well, then you will see this actual fall in prices, okay? The increase in the amount, in the rate of production of goods will exceed the increase in the rate of the money supply, okay? And prices will therefore fall, okay? Okay, so let's look at the history of deflation in the U.S. Just like many other market economies, prices fell in the U.S. throughout the 19th century. The reason being that the rate of economic growth exceeded the rate of increase of the money supply, because we, for the most part, throughout that century had a gold standard. And it was a good, what we call a good deflation, okay? And many mainstream economists are coming around to the view that at least growth deflation is a good deflation. You can even see some articles in Fed journals talking about this. The Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, their economists refer to prices that fall as they had in China because more and more goods are being produced is a good deflation. Okay, of course it's good because it makes, even if our incomes, our salaries and wages don't change, okay, in nominal terms, each dollar buys more. Okay? So to give you an example, in the period that was the period of greatest economic growth in U.S. history, from 1880 to 1896, prices fell by 30%. Every year, that meant, on average, prices were almost 2% lower than they were the year before. I mean, can you imagine the price of automobiles going down today? The prices of, we'll get to other goods where prices do fall. But yet, did that stifle economic growth? Did that choke it off? No, because real GDP during that period grew by 85%, or 5% per year. Today, we struggle to have a rate of growth that can reach 3% per year. Okay. Let's take a little bit longer period, from 1870 to 1898. Wholesale prices dropped by 34%. Consumer prices fell by 47%. Consumer prices were almost cut in half during that period, okay? They fell at a rate of 2.5% per year. But real gross national product grew during that period at 4.5%. And everybody consumed more. Not only did they save more, but they consumed more. So consumption jumped by 2.3% per year. So let's take a look at the price level. If you'll note, in 1800, the prices began to rise, or fell for a while, then they began to rise, and then we had the War of 1812, government pumped money into the economy, we had a credit expansion, we had a boom, and then a recession, and then gold was reinstated, okay, because the banks were permitted to continue to operate and issue their notes and deposits without paying people their gold, without redeeming their notes in gold. But once gold redeemability was restored, we see the gold standard operating, and what happened, prices fell from an index of 200 down to an index of 100. So prices fell during that period. And they fell by 53% from 1819 to around the Civil War, at which time, there's a little blip there, if you notice, right here. The price began to rise, and that was as a result of the Second Bank of the United States, which in 1832 was vetoed. Its charter was vetoed, so it wasn't renewed by President Jackson. And then after that, we had an influx of silver into fractional reserve banks, and an influx from China and from other countries, Mexico. And that caused more notes to be produced, and we had another inflationary boom, and then a recession, okay? But outside of the periods where we had these paper money inflations, and then up to the Civil War, where the Civil War was financed by a huge paper money inflation, prices had fallen. And then when we restored the gold standard in 1879, prices then began to fall again under the classical gold standard. And once again, they were cut in half. They went from 200 to an index number of 100, okay? And the American economy grew between the end of the Civil War to World War I, right, to become the greatest industrial, it went from an agricultural economy to the greatest industrial power in the United States, in the world, okay? Okay, so let's look at some instances of, what we might call good deflation. We all love HD TVs. Many of us have taken advantage of LASIK eye surgery, and of course we're all wedded to our PCs and tablet computers and so on. Well, let's look at how these different industries have fared in terms of prices and in terms of growth. So a mainframe computer, which would probably fill this room, back in 1970, an IBM computer, and would take a number of people to operate, was $4.7 million, okay? And today, PCs are 20 times faster and have more memory than these huge mainframes, okay? Yet they sell for, less than $500 with their accessories, all right? So what happened? You would expect if prices fell from $4.7 million to $500, wouldn't that scare a neoclassical economist? Wouldn't we be afraid the whole industry would collapse? But of course, for Austrians, the importance isn't what prices of the output does, but the margin between prices and the costs of production. Okay? So obviously, there was tremendous technological improvement, tremendous capital investment in this industry, which lowered costs and made it more and more profitable. So prices fell by 90% between 1980 and 1999. And in 1980, it was only 500,000 PCs shipped. By 1999, 43 million were shipped. We've had further declines in prices since 1999. And by 2013, you had 315 million shipped. Okay, so from 1999 to 2013, the industry increased sixfold. Right? PC memory prices used to be $6.48 per megabyte in 1980, and they declined to less than 1 cent, okay, per megabyte by 2014. Okay, so costs fell as prices fell. Okay, the fall in costs made it more profitable to produce PCs, and you had people rushing in, new entrepreneurs rushing in to produce PCs, new companies starting, older companies increasing the amount that they're producing, and all of that caused the supply of PCs to increase and prices to fall naturally. This is natural. And who benefited? The companies benefited from higher profits, and we all benefited, okay, as consumers. Here's hard drive prices, okay. In 1980, they were near $1 million, okay, for a gigabyte of hard drive. By 2009, they had fallen to less than 10 cents, right? So that was due to capital investment and technological improvements. There in 1980, you have a huge, now that weighs over 4,000 pounds. Okay, it's a disk drive system. And it's 20 gigabytes. 20 gigabytes, okay? And it costs between $700,000 and a little over $1 million, okay? And then you can see by 2010, a 32 gigabyte chip had an estimated value of between $100 and $150, okay, compared to $1 million. And it weighed 1/1000th of a pound, okay? And you can see how small they are now, okay, these chips. What about HD TVs? 32 million television sets were sold in North America for an average price of $400, okay? And they had an average size of 27 inches, diagonal inches. And then by 2015, 44 million sets were sold. That is, the industry increased. The price increased for a set, but per inch, okay, per diagonal inch, the price fell from $14.81 to $12.10. There was a long-term fall in prices. The first HD TV was sold in Japan for $36,000 back in 1990, and prices have come down until today. You can get one for, $500 of much greater quality. Okay, so why should we be afraid? Okay, if inflation is good, deflation is good in particular industries, all the economy is made up of different industries and different firms in those industries. Why shouldn't it be good for the economy as a whole? Well, it is. It is good. Okay? There's nothing wrong with it. The deflation phobia has no basis in fact whatsoever. And then laser eye surgery and cosmetic surgery, LASIK eye surgery started in 1992, but 1998 it was $4,000 per eye. That's a mistake in 2013. I updated the figures here for 2018. It was $2,000 per eye. That should have been $3,000. So the price of LASIK eye surgery was cut in half. Okay, Botox treatments went from $365 for a treatment that was sort of backward and so on until today. You can find it on discount websites for $149 and so on. Though the average price today is probably still around $375. Liposuction also went down in price, but they do more complicated procedures today, so the price is higher. But for the quality that you get, it is per unit of quality, the price has fallen. Okay, so that's growth deflation. And I mean, I defy any economist, any mainstream economist, to explain why that should be bad. And what they do is, well, they say, well, you know, if prices fall, if we have deflation, then at some point the interest rate will reach zero and can't go below zero to take into account a big deflation. But the point is, why would people just speculate on interest rates? If people really expected prices to fall, okay, in the future, and therefore took that into account when they were taking out loans, that each dollar they paid back would be worth more, and therefore that they want to pay a lower interest rate. Well, then, if that were true, why don't the same people take into account the fact that the prices will fall in the future, and therefore hold back their expenditures and not purchase? Which means that prices would fall instead of interest rates. Okay, that's the point that Murray Rothbard makes in his book Man, Economy, and State, and I recommend that you look at that. I mean, it's a little more technical. I don't want to get into it here. Okay. So let's talk about the second myth, which is deflation prolongs and intensifies recessions, because we tend to have a lot of falling prices or greatly falling prices during a recession, okay? So the claim is made that it turns recession into a deep depression of the kind that we had during the Great Depression. But in fact, as Austrian economists have shown, deflation is exactly the cure for the recession, and it speeds up the recovery from the recession, okay? In fact, it prevents recessions from degenerating into full-blown recessions. So what is speculative deflation? Well, that's a situation where after an inflationary boom, at the top of an inflationary boom, the wages and costs of production have been bid very high, and the central bank cuts back on its increase in the money supply. So suddenly now, costs are too high for prices, right? So under a gold standard, prices would immediately fall because entrepreneurs would stop buying inputs, they would stop buying labor, and because they didn't want to pay the high wages and so on, it wasn't profitable. And you would have an adjustment of costs to prices and a reestablishment of profits. But in modern times, with labor unions, minimum wages, and so on, other government interventions, it takes a while for wages to fall, right? But in any case, the deflation of wages is a good thing. Okay, wages need to fall and other costs need to fall so that you reestablish the profit margin. Okay, it's not high prices, as I said before, that spurs investment. Okay, what spurs investment is the prospect that the price, whatever the price of the product is going to be, is higher than the cost, so that there's a profit to be made. Okay, or at least there's an interest return to be made a return on the money invested. So bottom line is that entrepreneurs would rather hold cash, okay, and refrain from purchasing labor and investing in capital goods and so on until costs have come down in relation to prices. So it's not, we don't need a deflation of all prices and during a recession or a depression, okay? What we need is a deflation of those prices that have been bid artificially high, okay? So deflation is a good way of reestablishing profit margins. And also from the point of view of households, all right? Households are now worried about not getting their bonuses at work or actually having their wages cut and salaries cut or even getting laid off. So they're very uncertain about the future prospects of their income. So as a result, what they'll do is they'll hold money rather than spend it on consumer goods. Okay. They also expect prices to fall because they see falling prices around them. They expect them to fall more, and so they'll hold money until prices have fallen. Okay. It's only when the prices fall to what people expect them to be, both businesses and households, that they'll begin spending money again. So the best thing that can happen is that price can fall very rapidly. Okay. The best thing that can happen from the point of view of recovering from a recession or depression. Okay. To try to hold them up through government programs, through monetary policy, just prolongs the recovery from the recession. And that's exactly what has happened from as a result of government policies in the recession of 2007 through 2009, which we really have just recovered from a year or two ago. That is, we've just reached the point that we were at before 2007, before the financial meltdown. So let's talk a little. Let me give you a case study here, the Forgotten Depression of 1920-21. That used to be called the Great Depression. That was called the Great Depression because people hadn't seen anything like it, okay, anything as deep as that depression before. Of course, it was caused by Fed monetary policy. Remember, the Federal Reserve System had been established in 1914 by an act of Congress, and it was signed by President Woodrow Wilson. And by they began to cut the reserve ratio, which allowed banks to lend out a greater proportion of their deposits. They began to inject reserves into the system. They began to centralize the reserves. That is, all the gold was mandated. It was mandated that all the gold that banks were holding should be held at the Federal Reserve, their local Federal Reserve banks, and that they would hold Federal Reserve notes as backing. In any case, this allowed the Fed, these policies allowed the Fed to increase the money supply by over 15% per year, which is extremely high. Under the gold standard, if prices went up by 1% a year for a number of years, that was considered a large inflation, okay? There was a situation from 1896 to 1913 in which prices rose from prices rose from 1896 to 1940, prices rose by a total of 13%. That is less than 1% per year, and everyone thought that was a great inflation. Okay, 13% over like 15 or 16 years. Because under gold standard, prices tended to fall every year. People weren't used to prices going up at all. In any case, the U.S. product prices rose, the GDP deflator, okay, that is products produced here in the U.S., both consumer goods and capital goods, they rose by about 15% per year for about 4 years, 5 years. And then consumer prices rose by about 14% per year. And then when the Fed tightened up on the money supply, stopped increasing it as rapidly, and in fact actually deflated it, there was a depression. It was deep. So total spending in the economy, which is nominal GNP, total spending in the economy fell by 24%. Okay, that's 1/4 of spending just disappeared from 1920 to 1921. Okay. So spending went from 91 billion all the way down to 69 billion. And real GNP, the real output of goods and services, shrunk by nearly 10% during that time. That's a very deep recession or depression, okay? And unemployment shot up to 15%. And we had a steep deflation in the monetary sense, too. The money supply grew by about 2.9%, which was very low compared to, remember, it was growing at 15% before that in 1920, and then it actually shrunk. The Fed actually allowed the money supply to decrease in 1921 by 7%. General prices fell very steeply, 16.6% in 21 and 8.1% in 1922. Consumer prices fell, okay, you can see there. And wholesale prices were cut in half. They fell very rapidly and very steeply, okay, from mid-1920 to mid-1921. And wages fell a little bit more slowly over those 2 years, okay. The fact that wages fell by only 11% means that people's real wages were actually going up during that period of time, at least those people who were successful in maintaining their jobs. And that comes from James Grant's book, which I recommend to everyone. It's written, he's a very good writer. It's written for the layperson, The Forgotten Depression, okay? So despite its depth, okay, and the depth of, or how steeply prices fell and how steeply the GNP, was then called GNP, declined, it was over after only 18 months. In fact, there was debates in Congress going on that maybe we should pass laws to implement public works, have people, build dams and build new highways and so on. But by the time, by the time they arrived at any kind of conclusion, they had not yet arrived at any kind of conclusion or introduced any bill, the recession was over, okay? But yet contrast that with the Great Depression, which lasted until 1940. That is, we didn't recover from that recession until 1940, okay? And what was the reason for that? Well, unlike the 2021 episode, the 1929 Depression was confronted by government who wanted to do something, an activist government. So both Herbert Hoover, then later Franklin D. Roosevelt, interfered in the labor market, minimum wages, forced collective bargaining, getting businesses together and making them pledge not to cut their wages, so product prices couldn't fall. In product markets, there were the price supports to keep the prices of agricultural products up while people were going hungry. They were destroying different crops and so on to reduce supply and keep prices up. The money during the 1930s, we went off the gold standard in 1933, and we had a monetary standard that was decided by how Franklin Roosevelt felt each day when he got up and set the price of gold at a different price, okay? Which we devalued the dollar, that is, we inflated, trying to keep prices up. And then we had higher taxes and more regulations and so on. So all of those things interfered with the adjustment process. And now some mainstream economists, very heroically, have begun to say that the monetarists are wrong. It wasn't a failure of monetary policy. So the monetarists, who tend to be free market economists, claim the Great Depression resulted from government allowing the money supply to shrink, which it did for only a few quarters, okay, in the early 1930s. Whereas these other mainstream economists, one of whom is named Lee Ohanian, a famous macroeconomist from UCLA, have pointed out that it's not monetary policy failure, it was labor market policy failure. The unions implementing a minimum wage for the first time, and other interferences by the Hoover administration, which got businesses together and pledged to not to cut wages, okay? So people are starting to come around somewhat, the mainstream, or at least some of them, to the Misesian and Rothbardian view of depressions. But what was very interesting, this is from 1974, what did the Keynesians say about 1920-21? Well, they pretty much didn't say anything about it. But I did find something by an expert on business cycle theory, a Keynesian expert back in 1974. Here's what he wrote when he talked about this. He said, the downswing was severe, but relatively short. Its outstanding feature was the extreme decline in prices, so he admit prices collapsed. Government policy to moderate the depression and speed recovery was minimal. The government didn't do anything, didn't run deficits. The central bank didn't increase the money supply. In fact, they decreased the money supply, as we saw. The Federal Reserve authorities were largely passive, nor was any use made of fiscal policy. The federal budget was deflationary while the downswing was in progress. That is, it was balanced. You had a balanced budget. And then he concludes, despite the absence of a stimulative government policy, however, recovery was not long delayed. But if you go on and continue to read, he doesn't explain why. He doesn't explain how that could happen given the Keynesian framework, that depressions are caused by a lack of aggregate demand, as Professor Newman 1, who is Jonathan Newman, had told us, okay? The good Newman. No, anyway. And then let me finish up with the myths and reality 3. The empirical evidence, supposedly, this is the myth, shows a strong link between deflation and depression. When you get deflation, a depression will follow. Okay, it's not long before you get a depression. What's the reality? Well, there's been 2 or 3 really good studies now by mainstream economists. Well, one by an Austrian and 2 by mainstream economists that point out that aside from the Great Depression in the years 1929 to 1934, there is absolutely no empirical evidence or link between deflation and depression, okay? The Great Depression is, as they say in econometrics, an outlier, okay? So let me just show you this graph and just a couple of other graphs before I end. If you notice, the solid line is the total output in the U.S. economy, okay? And notice that it increases from 1800, okay, pretty steadily with a few dips, okay, all the way through 2000, okay? But notice what happens to prices, okay? Prices are shown, indicated by the dotted line, okay? So prices fall from about 1819, okay, to about 1860, and then they fall again from after the Civil War. But notice that no matter what prices are doing, which way they're going, there is no correlation between the two. Output just keeps growing, except, and I don't know if you can see it here, except right here, where we have the Great Depression, okay? And you have deflation here, okay? But otherwise, prices and output are not correlated. So there was an empirical study by two economists, and that was used 16 countries over 100 years, and these episodes were broken into 5-year periods, and it covered 73 episodes of deflation and 29 depression episodes. And they found that excluding the Great Depression, 65 of the 73 deflation episodes involved absolutely no depression, while 21 of the 29 depression episodes were not associated with deflation, okay? So in other words, 90% of deflation episodes did not result in depression. That was in the American Economic Review, the Papers and Proceedings, which is in the top 10, okay? The American Economic Review is the top-ranked journal, but its proceedings is sort of still in the top 10. That is the papers that are given at conferences. The author's conclusion, the data suggests that deflation is not closely related to depressions. A broad historical outlook finds more periods of deflation with reasonable growth than with depression, okay, and many more periods of depression with inflation than with deflation. Overall, the data show virtually no link between deflation and depression. Well, Austrians could have told you that. Didn't have to go through all of this. And then there was a great article, and I'm going to really pump up this article because it was published in our journal, the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics that I edit, by a young Czech economist, which was even more comprehensive than the article by Atkinson and Keogh. Pavel Riska studied 20 countries. From 1804 to 2015, he used annual data, not average of 5-year data. And so he had over 3,200 observations. He had to throw out 1,000 observations for various reasons. So he had over 2,000 observations. And I just want to get to what he found. He basically found the average annual output growth for inflationary years was 2.85%. For deflationary years, 2.73%. It's slightly smaller, but it's statistically insignificant. There's really no difference between the two. So there's no difference in performance of the economy with deflation or inflation, right? There's one other point I wanted to make here. And once you throw out the Great Depression, which is an outlier, okay, which is unlike all the other episodes, and which we know involve heavy government intervention. Once you throw that out, you get Riska's conclusion. The Great Depression stands out as the only episode in the sample with a statistically and economically significant relationship between output and prices. When one leaves out the Great Depression, which represents only 90 out of the 2,000 observations, the correlations between inflation and output growth in the rest of the sample lose their significance entirely. And that means that there's almost no correlation. It's almost a zero correlation between falls in output and the fall in prices, deflation and depression, okay? And then when you do have a positive correlation between deflation and depression, but only during the Great Depression. Okay, so I'll end there, and we have a minute for a question. If someone has a question, I'll answer one. Yes?
Yeah, so what do you make of India's confiscation program? I believe it was
Yeah, well, what they did was what were the notes? I actually had I didn't really want to do this, but let's see. So they got rid of the 501,000 rupee note, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what they did was that they made people, forced people to go to banks, turn in the notes, And they gave the money in their accounts that they could withdraw different money. But again, they limited how much you could take out. So that's a deflation. Okay, that's a forced deflation. And it interferes with people's property rights, and it distorts the economy. Okay, trade slowed down because of these lack of small notes. Okay, so I mean that's an argument to just get rid of, separate government from money. Just like we say we separate religion in the United States from government, we have to separate money from government completely. And so these types of things won't happen. And stop collecting government statistics so no one will ever know if we have a deflation, which I love, which I tell my students about. People worried about the balance of trade deficit in the United States. So I said, well, what state do you live in? And they say, I live in New York. I said, okay, what's the balance of trade deficit? So I don't know. Because they don't collect the statistics. So many states have balance of trade deficits with other states and so on, okay? Get rid of these government statistics. I mean, allow businesses to collect statistics that are germane to their economic activity. Okay, last question real quick.
What about in the case of deflation and exports? So, like developing nations, they're scared of deflation because it might lessen exports. So
They're scared of deflation because it would, well, it depends on what kind of exchange rate they have. That's another story. But if they had a fixed exchange rate, lower prices in their country would spur their exports. It would be cheaper, okay, if it was a fixed exchange rate. Okay. All right, I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.